Did you know one of the world's most powerful dynasties began with a simple wool merchant and a quiet bank ledger? It's true. And no, this isn't a fairy tale. This is Florence in the early 15th century, where cobblestone streets echo with the sounds of horseshoes and gossip, and somewhere in the background, the Medici name begins to hum with possibility. You blink your eyes, open to the smell of damp parchment, the sharp edge of ink, and the sweet incense curling out from a chapel nearby. You're not royalty. Not yet. You're standing in the modest bottega of Giovanni di Bici de' Medici, a man with a sharp mind for money and a knack for staying out of trouble. Well, mostly, Florence is tense. This is a city of artists, traders, guild masters, and also assassins, rival families, and the constant itch of political backstabbing. It's beautiful and brutal. Power is a game here, played slowly, with masks and marble. And Giovanni, he's just opened a bank. But this bank isn't just any bank. It's quiet, dignified, and unlike the rest, rooted in trust. That's rare in a world where defaulting on a loan might earn you a knife in the back. Giovanni understands two things very well. First, that people will do anything for stability, and second, that numbers never lie. While others show off with gold-stitched cloaks and bribe judges, he builds relationships. It begins with the wool trade. The Medici were technically members of the Arte della Lana Florence's wool guild, and Giovanni works closely with merchants, moving product from Flanders to Florence. It's not glamorous. It's logistics, contracts, and diplomacy. But he's methodical, like a chess player rearranging pawns before the real game begins. Soon, the Medici Bank handles more than wool money. It begins to hold deposits for bishops, for nobles, for other merchants who, like that, the bank is discreet and, most importantly, safe. That's how dynasties are born, not in battle, but in balance sheets. Giovanni doesn't chase office. In fact, he avoids public power like it's contagious. He knows Florence eats its leaders, so he supports others quietly. Funds public buildings, donates to churches, and lets the people of Florence say, "Look how generous he is," instead of, "Look how rich." But don't let that modesty fool you. He's calculating. Behind the gentle smile is a man who's already planning how his sons will inherit not just money, but influence. And here's a quirky detail. Giovanni installs a bell above his bank's door. When a deposit is made, the bell rings. Over time, the Medici bell becomes a kind of heartbeat in the city, soft, steady, trustworthy. Now picture the city around him. Market stalls with figs and salted fish. Painters arguing over commissions. Stone carvers chipping away at saintly robes. And over it all, the slow, careful accumulation of power, like wax dripping from a candle until it forms a solid shape. And while Giovanni builds his fortune, Europe is trembling. The Great Schism has only recently ended. The 100 Years' War is raging. The plague isn't exactly ancient history. Uncertainty rules. But in Florence, there's one place you can put your money and sleep at night: the Medici Bank. By the time Giovanni dies, he's one of the richest men in Florence. But more importantly, he's left behind something much more dangerous: sons who understand his game. Enter Cosimo, but not yet. First, take one last look at Giovanni, calm, cautious, and clever. The kind of man who'd rather lend a fortune than raise a sword. A banker, a strategist, the spark that will ignite a renaissance. And maybe ask yourself, how many revolutions begin with a man behind a desk? You're standing in the atrium of a Medici palazzo, sunlight glinting off polished stone, and your fingers brushing the soft grain of imported marble, when Cosimo de' Medici steps into the room like he's been summoned by destiny itself. He isn't flashy. In fact, he's almost quiet. But don't let that fool you. There's iron in his stillness, the kind that bends other men without them even realizing it. Cosimo inherited his father Giovanni's fortune, but more importantly, he inherited his father's instincts, his sense of timing, his taste for caution, and his belief that true power is exercised gently, like a painter's brushstroke rather than a soldier's strike. But unlike Giovanni, Cosimo doesn't just avoid politics, he uses it. Silently, subtly, like a spider reinforcing the corners of a web already catching flies. By now, the Medici Bank is no longer just a financial institution. It's a lifeline for half of Europe. It has branches in Rome, Venice, Bruges, Geneva, and even London. The papacy borrows from it. Princes rely on it. And Cosimo, seated behind a modest writing desk, understands something crucial. Money is power, but the perception of virtue is power's most reliable disguise. Florence, meanwhile, is a storm barely held together by charm. The Albizzi family, one of the city's dominant noble clans, is growing suspicious of Cosimo's quiet rise. They control the Signoria, the rotating council of Florentine government, but they sense their grip loosening. Cosimo funds public works. He builds libraries. He quietly supports artists and architects. People love him for it. The tension cracks when the Albizzi accuse him of trying to undermine the Republic. Cosimo is arrested, locked in a tower cell, and the future of the Medici seems to hang by a thread thinner than spun gold. But here's the thing. They don't kill him, because even his enemies bank with him. Even the guards watching his cell know who signs their cousin's pay. Money, once again, makes blood seem less appealing. Eventually, Cosimo is exiled, not killed. He leaves Florence in 1433, crossing the Arno under gray skies and silent stairs. But even in exile, he's working. He travels to Venice, where he continues managing the bank and, more cleverly, using his wealth to fund allies back home. Here's a strange little detail in exile. Cosimo keeps a pocket notebook of Florence's elite, not debts, personalities, strengths, weaknesses, fears. It's said he once gave a struggling painter enough money to live for a year, only to call in that favor with a single nod when back in Florence. Within a year, Florence is wobbling. The economy falters without Cosimo's stabilizing bank. Political support begins to shift. Those who cheered his exile start regretting it. And in 1434, the tide turns. Cosimo returns to Florence not with armies, but with momentum. And just like that, he doesn't just recover power, he becomes Florence. But Cosimo doesn't call himself ruler. No titles, no crowns. He's just a private citizen. A private citizen whose allies now control most of the city government. A private citizen whose family name is whispered with admiration or fear in every square. He's the puppeteer with his hands hidden. This is the moment the Medici legend hardens into something eternal. Cosimo begins transforming Florence not with swords, but with domes and frescoes. He funds Filippo Brunelleschi, the architect mad enough to complete the Duomo Florence's towering cathedral dome that had baffled engineers for decades. He sponsors Fra Angelico, Donatello, and Michelozzo. Florence is no longer just wealthy, it's radiant. It glows with the first true fires of the Renaissance. And all the while, Cosimo moves like a shadow, respectful, measured, deliberate. He avoids extravagance. He walks the city streets like any other citizen, stopping to greet bakers and students alike. But make no mistake, he is watching everything. And yet, there's a cost. He grows tired. The constant balancing act. The need to hold back rivals while elevating beauty and faith wears on him. His son, Piero, begins taking on more duties. But even as his health declines, Cosimo continues funding libraries, churches, hospitals. Before his death in 1464, he's declared Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. Historians still argue whether Cosimo was a benevolent genius or a calculating manipulator in monk's clothing. Maybe both. Probably both. But as you walk through a Florence blooming with sculpture and song, ask yourself, what legacy would you rather leave behind, a battlefield of corpses or a city of light? You rise early, strolling through the quiet Florence streets as they slowly fill with sound, the clip of hooves, the crackle of bread crusts in morning ovens, the distant bells of Santa Maria del Fiore. Cosimo is gone now, but his shadow still hugs the buildings. And in his place stands Piero de' Medici, Cosimo's eldest son. They call him Piero the Gouty, not the most flattering nickname, but it's accurate. His health is fragile, his legs swollen, and his face often pale from pain. Yet despite the weakness of his body, his grip on power is surprisingly strong. At first, many assume Piero is too soft, too sickly, too slow to maintain what his father built. The old rivals, the Albizzi, the Strozzi, the Pazzi, they start sniffing around like wolves who've just heard the shepherds croaked. But Piero, he's been watching, listening, preparing, and he has the ledger books to prove it. One of the strangest things about Renaissance power, it lives inside account books. Piero doesn't just know who owes the Medici Bank money. He knows who owes them favors and who fears being publicly reminded. One by one, he plays his hand, discreetly, decisively. And when conspiracies begin to rise, he doesn't hesitate to expose them to the public. You attend one of his audiences, an open session in the Medici Palace, where citizens bring their petitions. You expect a sick man slouched in a chair. Instead, you find a shrewd judge calmly fielding complaints, gently shifting opinion with only a few words. A tax dispute here, a property exemption there. It's like he's gardening, pruning just enough to keep the flowers blooming. Still, not everything goes smoothly. In 1466, a powerful conspiracy nearly topples the Medici. Backed by disgruntled noble families and supported by external forces, including a suspicious Milanese hand, the plot aims to assassinate Piero and shatter the Medici influence. They plan the attack for a procession day. But Piero, cautious to the core, changes the route at the last moment. A whisper saved him. Or maybe paranoia did. The conspirators are caught. Their leader is executed, publicly. The others are exiled. The Medici net tightens. And just as you think this will be Piero's great moment, his body begins to fail again. The gout worsens. He struggles to walk. His speech falters at times. And the whispers return not of conspiracy this time, but of succession. Because now, all eyes turn to Piero's son, Lorenzo. If Cosimo was the cautious architect and Piero the guarded steward, Lorenzo is a comet in a velvet doublet. He's barely 20, but already speaks like a senator and rides like a knight. He's the grandson of Florence's builder, and the city seems to hum in his presence. You see it when he enters the church for a wedding head's turn. You hear it when he debates poetry in a tavern. Patricians listen. You feel it when he walks through the market square. Merchants offer him their finest goods. Unasked, Piero, now bedridden, knows what Florence needs. He names Lorenzo his political heir. The city's factions murmur uneasily. He's too young, too bold, too flashy. But when Piero dies in 1469, Lorenzo ascends without a ripple. Somehow, everyone already believes he's in charge. And oh, what a charge it is. Lorenzo wastes no time. He throws a lavish tournament in his first year as de facto ruler, part celebration, part statement. He wears crimson and gold, recites his own poems, rides the fastest horse. It's not subtle, but it works. The people love him. The nobles tolerate him. The artists, they begin to orbit him like moths to a gilded lantern. But here's the real genius. Lorenzo isn't just a showman. Beneath the performance lies a razor-sharp mind. He reforms taxes to keep the poor from rebellion and the rich just annoyed enough to stay honest. He manages diplomacy between warring Italian city-states. He reads classical philosophy by candlelight while penning verses of his own. And the Medici Bank. He monitors it closely, even as political duties threaten to pull his focus. The bank is still the engine of their power, but Lorenzo begins to feel it sputter. Some branches overseas are underperforming. Some rivals are gaining ground. For the first time in decades, the Medici's financial dominance isn't absolute. Still, Lorenzo doesn't panic. He doubles down on culture. He invites Botticelli to paint. He funds Michelangelo as a teenager. He turns Florence into a gallery, a poem, a sermon in color and marble. Historians still argue whether Lorenzo's banking decisions were wise or reckless, whether he sacrificed long-term stability for artistic immortality, whether he was a genius or simply lucky to be born at the right time with the right name. But as you walk through the Uffizi centuries later and see a painting that once hung in a Medici hallway, ask yourself if you could trade financial security for a legacy that outlives empires. Would you? Lorenzo never hesitated. He wanted to be remembered. And now, you're remembering him. You stand near the marble steps of Santa Croce as the bells chime low and slow, echoing across the city that now pulses under one man's vision, Lorenzo de' Medici. They call him Il Magnifico. Not officially, of course. It's not a title granted by state or church. It's a nickname, a whisper, a worship. And yet, it feels more royal than any crown. What does it mean to be magnificent in Renaissance Florence? Well, it's not about thrones or armies. It's about presence, command, and patronage. Especially patronage. Lorenzo doesn't just sponsor artists. He cultivates them like a vintner tending vines. You watch as he strolls through his private workshop courtyard, what today we might call an artist's incubator. Young men chisel stone under open sky. They sketch furiously, smudging charcoal on vellum. Some are barely out of childhood. One of them, a wiry, intense boy with a hammer too large for his hands, will one day carve a David that stuns the world. Yes, that's Michelangelo. Lorenzo sees the potential. He arranges tutors, funding, opportunities. He doesn't tell them what to create. He gives them space, encouragement, and above all, protection. Florence is still a republic in theory, but in reality it bends toward Lorenzo. And Lorenzo bends that power toward beauty. Meanwhile, the Medici palace swells with masterpieces. You glance at frescoes painted directly on walls, images of myth and religion tangled like vines. Botticelli's Primavera blooms with allegory in a Medici salon. Politicians mingle with poets, priests with painters. Every corner hums with intellectual fire, but Lorenzo isn't just an aesthete in velvet slippers. He's a strategist, a diplomat, a chess player who sees not just pieces, but the mood of the room. In 1478, that room nearly explodes. It's a Sunday in April, and you're in the Grand Cathedral Florence's Duomo. High Mass, bright sun pouring through stained glass, and suddenly, chaos. The Pazzi conspiracy strikes. The Pazzi family, rich. Rival bankers with papal backing want Lorenzo out of the way, literally. Along with his brother, Giuliano, they choose the most shocking moment during the Eucharist in front of the entire city. Giuliano is stabbed 19 times. Lorenzo is wounded but survives, escaping into the sacristy with the help of a quick-thinking ally. Outside, panic erupts, and then revenge. The city turns, not against the Medici, against their enemies. Crowds chase the conspirators through the streets. No trial, no mercy. Bodies swing from windows by sunset. It's a bloodbath, but a pointed one. Florence sends a message. Betrayal is suicide. Lorenzo emerges not just alive, but transformed. The near-death experience cements his authority. The Pope, yes, the Pope excommunicates him. Florence is placed under interdict. Technically, no one in the city is supposed to receive sacraments until Lorenzo is punished. So what does he do? He sails to Naples. That's right, with no army, no backup, and no guarantee he'll return alive. Lorenzo sets sail to negotiate directly with King Ferrante of Naples, a man notorious for keeping enemies in his dungeon long enough to forget sunlight. But Lorenzo charms him, dazzles him, convinces him. He returns to Florence not in chains, but in triumph. You watch the crowds gather along the Arno to greet him. Flowers thrown in the street. Songs echoing from balconies. It's not just admiration, it's worship. Still, Lorenzo doesn't rest. He uses this newfound power to secure Florence's place in the Italian balance. He allies with Milan, calms tensions with Rome, keeps Venice at arm's length, and all without raising a sword. Historians still argue whether Lorenzo was more poet or politician, whether he ruled through love, fear, or simply superior networking, whether the Pazzi failure was divine favor or sheer luck. But here's the truth you feel in the hush of his study. Where a candle flickers beside half-finished verses and diplomatic letters, Lorenzo understands the power of story. He knows Florence doesn't need another warlord. It needs a myth, a guardian of greatness. So that's what he becomes. And beneath that legend, he crafts one of the most stable, culturally radiant decades in Florentine history. All while the world beyond his borders grows darker. France sharpens its knives. Spain lurches toward unification. The Ottoman Empire pushes westward. The Renaissance isn't safe. It's just well-dressed. But in Lorenzo's Florence, for now, the light still holds, and you, You walk those illuminated halls, breathe the ink and fresco air, and wonder how long can magnificence last. The sun hangs low over the terracotta rooftops, bathing Florence in a final wash of gold as evening bells toll from Santa Maria del Fiore. You linger in the shadow of the Palazzo Medici, watching the light strike its rusticated stone facade, more fortress than home, but elegant in a way that only the Medici could pull off. Inside, Lorenzo de Medici leans over a desk scattered with papers, wax seals, and parchment scrolls. The scent of ink and warmed vellum lingers in the air. He's not reviewing paintings tonight. He's playing chess with Europe. Lorenzo isn't just Florence's de facto ruler. He's its diplomatic backbone. With his brother, Giuliano, gone, and the scars of the Pazzi conspiracy still fresh, Lorenzo begins turning his attention outward. You see it in his letters, in the way he drafts alliances, not as treaties, but as performances crafted for beauty and impact, like poetry in motion. Florence doesn't command armies like Milan or Venice. It doesn't control a vast coastline or a fearsome navy. What it has is Lorenzo. And what Lorenzo has is charm. He writes to Ludovico Sforza in Milan with flattery and veiled reminders. He sends gifts to Ferrante of Naples, rare books, silk robes, sometimes even trained falcons. He negotiates with Pope Sixtus IV's successors through well-placed Medici cardinals. And every move is calibrated. Not grand gestures, but delicate adjustments, like tuning the strings of a lyre before a performance. It's a performance where the stakes are survival. Italy, in the late 15th century, isn't a country. It's a kaleidoscope of rival states, duchies, and republics, all tangled in family ties and vendettas. At any given moment, Milan might invade Genoa, Venice might blockade Naples, the Pope might bless or excommunicate a ruler, depending on the direction of the wind and how many florins he's been gifted. And through it all, Lorenzo threads the needle. You trail behind him during his walks across Florence, listening as merchants bow and scholars stop to ask questions. He funds churches, yes, but also schools. He builds libraries. He establishes philosophical circles like the Platonic Academy, where humanist thinkers debate ancient wisdom under frescoed ceilings. It's not just politics. It's cultural engineering. Lorenzo wants Florence to be not just safe, but exceptional. Not just beautiful, but smart. So he elevates learning, encourages publishing, sponsors translations of Greek texts, and in doing so, he ensures Florence doesn't just survive, it leads. One obscure fact, Lorenzo even dabbled in writing himself. He composed poetry, canzoni, sonnets, carnival songs. Some were religious, others, not so much. Picture a man who could both host a philosophical discussion on Plato and belt out slightly naughty verses during a festival parade, multifaceted to say the least. Still, trouble always simmers. Florence's rival families haven't vanished. They've just gone quiet. And outside the city, Europe's powers are watching. France eyes northern Italy. The Holy Roman Empire looms. Even Spain, newly united under Ferdinand and Isabella, begins to cast its shadow. And then there's the Vatican. While Lorenzo charms cardinals and placates popes, a new force rises within the church, one Lorenzo can't quite predict. You overhear it first in whispered sermons, soft but sharp. A Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola is beginning to preach in Florence. He's not famous yet, not influential, but his tone cuts through velvet and gold like a chisel. He talks of corruption, of false splendor, of the fire that must come to cleanse Italy. It's not aimed directly at Lorenzo, not yet, but you feel a chill. Still, Lorenzo presses forward. In 1480, when Naples and the Papal States threaten Florence, he again does what few rulers would dare. He rides personally to Naples, without escort, without army. He walks the marble halls of Ferrante's court, placing himself completely at the king's mercy. And somehow, again he wins Ferrante over. Historians still argue whether it was Lorenzo's eloquence, his daring, or Ferrante's pragmatism. But the result is the same peace, peace that saves Florence. As you watch him return home, greeted by a cheering city, there's something almost mythic in the moment. Lorenzo isn't a soldier. He doesn't conquer by blade or fire. He rules by presence, persuasion, a mastery of human nature that borders on supernatural. But even myths have limits. You begin to notice fatigue in his face. His walk slows. His letters grow more reflective, tinged with melancholy. He's only in his early 40s, but years of stress and illness are catching up. Gout plagues him. Rumors of kidney problems circulate. The city still praises him, but quietly. People begin asking what happens after. Because the thing about being a living legend, eventually you have to die. And Florence, glorious, gilded, precarious. Florence still stands on the scaffolding he built with charm, risk, and quiet terror. As you pass the city's fountains, hear the street musicians play beneath balconies draped in linen, and feel the warmth of candlelight flickering in artists' studios. You ask yourself, when the magnificent is gone, what's left behind? The garden is quiet tonight. You walk slowly along the gravel paths of the Medici villa at Careggi, where the scent of lavender and lemon balm clings to the cool evening air. Cypress trees stand like dark sentinels, and in the distance, the hills roll gently under a moonlit sky. Somewhere behind you, a lyre is being tuned. Soft voices rise in discussion, not about politics, but about Plato. This is the heart of Lorenzo's intellectual court, his hidden sanctuary from the turmoil of Florence. Here, under candlelight and frescoed ceilings, humanism breathes. You step inside a modest hall where the Platonic Academy gathers, men in long robes, mostly indigo and russet, sit cross-legged or lean over scrolls. Their conversation drifts from soul and virtue to love and divinity, weaving the threads of classical philosophy with Christian thought. Marsilio Ficino presides priest, philosopher, translator, and personal friend of Lorenzo. He's pale, almost ghostly, with an intensity that burns in his eyes. His Latin is flawless. His Greek is better. He speaks of Plato as though he just had lunch with him. And Lorenzo. He's here too, not as ruler, not as patron, but as a student, listening, laughing, asking sharp questions. He may be Florence's political mind, but in this circle, he is just another man reaching for the divine through reason. Humanism isn't just academic. It's a new way of seeing the world, a belief that humanity has dignity, that the soul is worth studying, that beauty and wisdom are connected. You watch as Ficino reads his own translations of Plato's dialogues, his voice low and melodic. The words are centuries old, but they feel alive, vibrant like a garden blooming in thought. A curious detail: Ficino believed in music's spiritual power. Sometimes, during these meetings, he'd play his lyre and chant Latin hymns. He said it helped align the soul with the cosmos. You're not sure about the cosmos, but here in this candlelit room, everything feels very aligned. Outside these walls, the world is sharpening. France is rattling sabers. Venice grows jealous. The papacy shifts like a weather vane. But inside, there is calm, and it's deeply intentional. Lorenzo knew that for Florence to remain powerful, it needed more than wealth or soldiers. It needed identity, and that identity had to be intellectual. So he funded not just thinkers, but publishers. You see printing presses working overtime to copy not just scripture, but Cicero, not just Bibles, but biographies of Roman emperors and glossaries of Greek myths. Florence begins to transform from a commercial capital into a beacon of Renaissance thought, a city where stone sculptors quote Virgil, and where schoolboys memorize Ovid before breakfast. This transformation doesn't happen by accident. You notice Lorenzo's quiet hand in curriculum changes, in scholarships for promising students, in the careful appointment of professors. The Medici don't just buy art, they cultivate minds. And minds, once cultivated, are hard to control. Which brings you to a rising tension. Down in Florence's streets, a different kind of preacher is gathering followers. Girolamo Savonarola, that intense Dominican friar with fire in his voice, has moved from quiet criticism to louder sermons. He warns of divine punishment, of Florence becoming a new Babylon, of the Medici's riches as gilded sin. He draws crowds, larger ones, each month. But here's the twist: Lorenzo lets him speak. Historians still argue whether Lorenzo underestimated him, tolerated him to appear open-minded, or secretly admired his zeal. Whatever the case, the friar continues to grow, even as Lorenzo's health fades. And yes, it's fading. You notice it in the way he rests his hand on a cane now, how he winces climbing stairs, how he cancels public appearances more often. Rumors spread tuberculosis, kidney failure, chronic fatigue. His physicians whisper about remedies, but nothing slows the decline. One night at Careggi, he retires early. You linger near his chamber door and hear Ficino enter quietly. They talk, not of banks or popes or rivalries, but of the soul, of what lies beyond. It's private, intimate. Two men, both devout in their own way, discussing death not with fear, but with philosophy. When Lorenzo finally slips into unconsciousness, the whole villa stills. Candles burn low. Outside, the cypresses sway under a soft breeze. You hear no crying, just silence, thick as prayer. He dies in 1492, barely 43 years old. That same year, across the Atlantic, Columbus sails. Across Italy, 1,000 plots stir. And here in Florence, a torch goes out. The Magnificent is gone, but his city remains. And now the question everyone fears: who steps into the light? Piero de' Medici, Lorenzo's son, is young, impulsive, unseasoned. He lacks his father's grace, subtlety, and restraint. Already, advisors raise eyebrows at his arrogance. Already, the Vatican eyes Florence with renewed hunger. As you walk back into the city, past statues and market stalls, you can feel it, the nervous shiver in the air. Florence without Lorenzo is like a ship without a helmsman, still afloat, still splendid, but drifting. Still, in the scriptoriums, the presses run. In the workshops, marble is still chiseled. And in the libraries, students still read Plato under the light of the Medici crest. For now, the days after Lorenzo's death are unusually bright for Florence. The Tuscan sun spills over terracotta rooftops, and the Arno glimmers with the kind of indifference only rivers have. They've seen too many rulers come and go. But you feel it in the city's bones. Something essential has changed. Like a theater performance without its lead actor, the stage still stands, but the spotlight is searching. You find yourself in the Palazzo Medici, where Piero de' Medici, newly at the helm, paces restlessly across a tiled floor. He's young, just over 20, and flush with inherited power. His tunic is crisp, gold embroidered, his chin high, but the weight of the family legacy clings to him like an ill-fitting cloak. He tries. Oh, he tries. He calls for advisors, makes speeches, signs edicts with an exaggerated flourish. He mimics his father's mannerisms, the smile, the pause before speaking, but it all feels rehearsed. Florence isn't buying it. You can see the doubt in the faces of the city council. They nod, but don't bow. They listen, but don't lean in. And worst of all, Piero lacks the one thing Lorenzo had in spades, the ability to balance the tightrope between elegance and ruthlessness. Within months, Piero starts making enemies. He insults old allies with careless words. He sides too openly with powerful families without the back-channel diplomacy Lorenzo excelled at. His impulsive nature makes him unpredictable. Florence begins to murmur. And in Florence, murmurs are warning bells. Then comes the storm. Across the Alps, a young and wildly ambitious French king named Charles VIII eyes Italy. And not just any piece of it, he wants Naples. But to get there, he must pass through Florence. And to pass through Florence, he must deal with Piero. You stand in the great audience hall as Charles's envoys arrive, draped in fur and blue velvet. They make their demands clear, allow French troops safe passage through Tuscan territory, or risk war. Piero is cornered, but instead of rallying allies or consulting his council, he panics in a move that even his supporters can't defend. Piero rides out to Charles's camp personally and concedes everything: fortresses, access, tribute. He caves without a fight, handing over key strongholds like a child forced to surrender toys. The backlash is volcanic. Back in Florence, the people seethe. The ruling council is blindsided. Merchants cry betrayal. Artists clutch their purses. The Medici name, once uttered with reverence, is now whispered with disdain. The city's patience, long nurtured by Lorenzo's grace, snaps, and into this chaos steps a familiar voice: Savonarola. Remember him, the Dominican friar with fire in his sermons and doom in his eyes. He's back, and this time, his words hit different. No longer the inconvenient prophet in the background. He becomes Florence's thunderous conscience. He declares Piero's surrender to France as divine punishment. He calls for repentance, for reform, for the banishment of worldly corruption. The crowds swell. The squares flood with people chanting not for the Medici, but for purification. You stand among them, watching as Piero, once heir to the most powerful house in Florence, slips out of the city under cover of night, barely ahead of an angry mob. It's 1494, and just like that, after nearly 60 years of rule, the Medici are gone. Banished, Florence declares itself a republic once more. The Medici crest is scraped from stone walls. Their bank, already weakened under Piero's poor management, collapses in a mess of unpaid debts and foreign seizures. And Savonarola, he takes center stage not as ruler, technically, but as the voice behind the curtain. He sets up a government based on Christian principles. He pushes for strict morality laws. He bans what he calls vanity's makeup, books, artworks considered sinful. There's even a bonfire, a real one, where citizens throw jewelry, musical instruments, and nude paintings into the flames. Historians still argue whether this was pious reform or power-hungry control in a holy disguise. You walk past the site of one of those bonfires. The ground is clean now, quiet, but you swear the air still smells faintly of smoke and rosewood. And yet Florence isn't so easily repressed. In secret workshops, painters still sketch. In quiet salons, philosophers still meet. Even as Savonarola tightens his grip, the spirit of the Renaissance resists. Then, inevitably, comes the backlash. The Pope, who once tolerated the friar's fury, grows tired of his accusations. Excommunication follows, then arrest, then trial. You don't have to be a prophet to know how this ends. Savonarola is burned in the very piazza where he once preached. His ashes scattered in the Arno. Another fire, another chapter closed. But the power vacuum remains. Florence wobbles, unsure of itself. The Medici are still in exile, scattered across Italy. But their name wounded, though it hasn't been erased. It echoes in memory, in architecture, in paintings signed and unsigned. You walk through an old cloister and see the familiar Medici balls etched faintly into a stone column, worn by weather, half chiseled away, but still there. The city hasn't forgotten, and neither have the Medici. The Medici may be scattered, but you can almost feel them scheming in the shadows. The years tick by, and Florence stumbles through a kind of identity crisis. Without the Medici, the Republic feels brittle, ruled more by factions than vision, more by compromise than leadership. The memory of Savonarola's theocracy still lingers like incense in a forgotten chapel. People are wary of strong men, of messiahs, of promises, and then, quietly, like a seed that never stopped growing, a Medici reappears. His name is Giovanni, son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. He isn't loud. He doesn't return with armies or threats. Instead, he returns as a cardinal. That's right, a Medici in scarlet robes, whispering Latin prayers instead of financial strategy. The twist: he was made a cardinal at the absurdly young age of 13. Which, honestly, might sound corrupt because it was, but it was also a masterstroke. Lorenzo had seen this coming. He'd planted his son not in Florence, but in Rome, and now Rome is calling. You find yourself in the corridors of the Vatican, under ceilings dripping with frescoes and politics. Giovanni de' Medici is smooth, patient, and terrifyingly well-connected. He knows which bishops to flatter, which families to court, which sins to overlook, and which to expose. The Medici aren't just bankers anymore. They're weavers of ecclesiastical power. Meanwhile, back in Florence, a new generation begins to stir. Supporters of the Medici, known as the Paleschi, whisper of restoration. Public memory is short. After all, people remember Lorenzo's elegance, not Piero's blunders. They miss the stable currency, the thriving arts, the illusion of harmony. The city's heart is softening. Then comes the real opportunity: Spain and France. Two giants locked in an Italian chess match begin shoving their pieces across the peninsula. Florence, once again, becomes a pawn. French troops stomp across Tuscan roads. Spanish armies eye the Arno. The Republic scrambles for alliances, for deals, for breathing room. And into this chaos steps Giovanni's cousin Giuliano de' Medici. Unlike the church-bound Giovanni, Giuliano is the face of worldly charm. He returns to Florence not in priestly robes, but with a mix of diplomacy and barely veiled pressure. Spanish support helps. So does the public weariness. After years of instability, the people are ready. Maybe not cheering, but tired enough to stop resisting. In 1512, the Medici are restored. But this isn't a restoration, it's a rebirth. The game has changed. They don't come back as Florence's rulers outright. No thrones, no crowns. They return as first citizens, as advisors, as sponsors. But really, everyone knows who's pulling the strings. Giuliano runs the city with velvet gloves. Giovanni, still in Rome, pushes pawns across the papal chessboard. And just 3 years later, Giovanni makes the ultimate move. You stand in a smoky Roman chapel, its marble echoing with whispered votes. The cardinals huddle, squinting at ballots, fingers crossed in subtle prayer or calculation. And when the final count is read, the impossible becomes real. Giovanni de' Medici is elected pope. He becomes Pope Leo X, a Medici, on St. Peter's throne. Let that sink in. The boy who once studied Latin under a Florentine tutor now wears the triple tiara of papal authority. The family that once financed wool merchants now commands the entire Catholic world. The news hits Florence like a thunderclap. Bells ring. Wine flows. The Medici crest is raised not just over banks, but over churches. The family has bridged heaven and earth, one son ruling Florence, the other ruling Christendom. And what does Leo X do with his power? Oh, he leans in. He begins funneling papal funds to beautify Florence lavishly. He commissions art, architecture, manuscripts. He invites scholars and poets to Rome, transforming the Vatican into a Renaissance playground. Historians still argue whether Leo was a patron of genius or just a Renaissance party boy with divine resources. You walk the Vatican corridors, past Raphael's frescoes, past golden goblets and embroidered vestments, and you can't help but think this is what Medici ambition always wanted: legacy wrapped in beauty. But as Leo builds, trouble brews. His generous spending drains the Vatican coffers. He authorizes the sale of indulgences, essentially pay-to-play forgiveness for sins to fund his dreams. That decision, seemingly bureaucratic at the time, will ignite a powder keg in Germany because someone is watching, a monk with a hammer and a list. But don't skip ahead. We're not in Wittenberg yet. For now, the Medici shine brighter than ever. They are no longer just merchants, or bankers, or Florentine grandees. They are kings in all but name, and kings never rest. You sit under the heavy arches of the Sistine Chapel, the air rich with incense and ambition, and it hits you this isn't just a family drama anymore. It's a continental saga. Because Leo X, that boy from Florence, is now shaping all of Europe. With one papal decree, he can bless or curse kingdoms. And, oh, does he bless? If you're part of the Medici inner circle, it's raining favors, bishoprics, land grants, art commissions. It's like Renaissance opera. You get a title. You get a palace. Florence is flush with prestige again, and the Medici bask in it, but even paradise gets expensive. Leo X's papacy, though glittering, is financially reckless. He's known to spend vast sums on feasts, carnivals, and pet projects. His court is legendary for its theatrical flair. You can almost hear the lute music echoing off frescoed walls. Taste the sugared almonds served in golden bowls. The Vatican treasury, not so sweet. It's rapidly draining, and that's where things get spicy. To refill those coffers, Leo turns to indulgences, essentially a spiritual credit system. Pay money, shave time off your stay in purgatory. Sounds convenient. Right. But it was more controversial than selling fake Taylor Swift tickets. You picture church doors in Saxony being pounded with a hammer. That monk we mentioned. Yeah, it's Martin Luther. He's had enough. His 95 Theses call out Rome's corruption, especially the indulgent sales. It's less a debate than a fire starter. The Protestant Reformation has begun, and just like that, the Medici papacy is at the center of one of history's biggest religious explosions. Now, let's shift from the Sistine Chapel back to Florence, because while Leo is setting the church ablaze unintentionally, his relatives are doubling down on earthly power. Giuliano de' Medici, the family's princely frontman, is being groomed to lead Florence with more formality. There's even talk of carving out a whole new Italian duchy for him. And in a twist of Renaissance matchmaking, he marries into French royalty. The Medici are playing at being royals now, not just local bosses. But Giuliano's reign is short. He dies young, and the family scrambles to fill the gap. Enter Lorenzo di Piero de' Medici, Leo's nephew. And yes, another Lorenzo. This one isn't quite the magnificent. Let's call him the strategist. Lorenzo becomes Duke of Urbino thanks to Leo's help. Naturally. And while he's not a poetic soul like his grandfather, he's cunning. You see him managing alliances, waging small wars, and perhaps most importantly, producing heirs. One of those heirs, Catherine de' Medici, but hold that name for later. For now, Lorenzo's focus is keeping the family stitched into the fabric of both Florentine and Roman politics. With Leo still Pope, it works. The Medici move through Europe like chess masters, and most of the time, they're holding the queen until they're not, because no papacy lasts forever. In 1521, Leo Thex dies suddenly, and it's a shockwave. The Vatican, that glittering Medici dome of power, is suddenly up for grabs again. The family's grip loosens. Worse, the new pope isn't exactly a fan. Adrian VI, a stern reformer, arrives like a cold bucket of water at a carnival. He criticizes corruption, snubs Roman excess, and takes a hard line against Medici-style politics. Imagine replacing a champagne-soaked art lover with a monk who thinks gold is tacky. And just like that, the Medici must pivot again. You find yourself back in Florence. The mood is shifting. The people remember the grandeur, but also the debts, the rivalries, the whispers of blasphemy and scandal. With Leo gone and Rome less friendly, Cracks begin to show. Lorenzo the strategist dies soon after, another hole in the family tapestry. So now, power consolidates around one name, Giulio de' Medici. Remember him, Leo's cousin, quiet, watching. Well, he's about to step into the spotlight. First, he becomes Florence's de facto ruler. Then, through backdoor Vatican deals and the kind of politicking that would make Machiavelli blush, Giulio ascends to the papacy in 1523. He becomes Pope Clement VII, a second Medici pope, in less than a generation. Let that sink in. A banking family from Florence now has not one, but two popes to its name. It's like the Medici just unlocked a secret level in the Renaissance game, except this one's darker. Because Clement's reign is not all feasts and frescoes. He inherits chaos. The Protestant Reformation is spreading like wildfire. The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, is becoming Europe's most dangerous man. France and Spain are wrestling for dominance, and Italy is their battleground. And in the middle, Florence, Rome, the Medici. Clement tries to play both sides, supporting France one day, then Charles the next. Historians still argue whether he was clever or just indecisive. Either way, it ends in disaster. In 1527, the unthinkable happens. Rome is sacked, not by pagans or barbarians, but by Christian troops, mutinous, unpaid soldiers under Charles V. The Eternal City is ravaged, monasteries looted, nuns assaulted, cardinals executed. Even the Sistine Chapel sees blood. And Clement, he flees. He hides in Castel Sant'Angelo, that old fortress of desperation, watching smoke rise over his papal city. It's one of the darkest moments in Medici history. Their power is crumbling, both in Rome and Florence. But if you know anything about the Medici by now, it's this: they don't stay down. You can still smell the ash in the air, even days after the sack. Rome lies wounded, the Sacred Heart of Christendom cracked open by soldiers who were supposed to protect it. And you're with Clement VII, that cautious, besieged Medici pope, peering out from the fortified walls of Castel Sant'Angelo. His face, once composed and calculating, is now gray with exhaustion. The Medici have seen disasters before, but this one bleeds papal robes and shatters golden ceilings. And Florence is watching. Back in Tuscany, the ripple effect of Rome's humiliation hits hard. The Medici name, once tied to strength and wealth, now stinks of weakness and failure. The city, always simmering with Republican idealism beneath the family's velvet glove, senses its moment. The Republicans rise, and the Medici fall again. It's 1527, and just like that, the family is exiled from Florence for the second time in half a century. The Palazzo Medici is ransacked. Symbols of Medici rule are torn down. Even Cosimo, the elder's tomb, is defaced by rioters. The message is clear. The Medici are not gods. They are men, and men can be removed. You walk through Florence's piazzas and hear speeches echoing: reform, liberty, godliness. These are the new buzzwords. But don't let the marble facades fool you. Beneath the idealism is chaos. The new republic struggles to govern. Factions squabble. Enemies close in. And the looming presence of the emperor, yes, Charles V, the very same whose troops sacked Rome, casts a long, cold shadow. And Clement, he doesn't forget. After years of humiliation and exile, the Medici regroup with a familiar tactic alliance. This time, it's not banking. It's not even bribery. It's marriage. Clement betroths his teenage niece, a clever and ambitious girl named Catherine de' Medici, to none other than Henry, second son of the French king. The year is 1533, the place Marseille. The stakes, European-scale power. You watch Catherine board the royal barge in a saffron gown, flanked by priests and French envoys. She's only 14, barely knows her husband-to-be. But her dowry is rich. Her bloodline, Medici, and her destiny. Oh, it's only to become Queen of France. It's one of the most strategic marriages in Medici history. And it works. Catherine plants the family flag firmly in French soil. And years later, when she becomes queen consort, then regent, she'll play politics like chess, with a dagger tucked in her bodice. But that's for another day. Right now, Clement has his eye on Florence, with imperial backing. He orchestrates a brutal campaign to reclaim the city. Imperial troops, yes. The same empire that once sacked Rome now march into Florence under the papal blessing. Irony much. The siege of Florence begins in 1529. You're perched on a battered wall with defenders, blacksmiths, students, veterans of forgotten skirmishes. Their city is starved, bombarded, bleeding, but still, it resists. Inside, Michelangelo, yes, the Sistine Chapel guy, is now designing fortifications. That's right. He's traded brushes for battlements. Because if anyone can sculpt a defense, it's him. But even genius can't stop fate. After 10 months of starvation, betrayal, and bombardment, Florence falls. In 1530, the Medici return in triumph. Not as merchant princes this time, but as dukes. No more pretending. No more soft power. The velvet gloves are off. Clement appoints his cousin, Alessandro de' Medici, as Duke of Florence, the first hereditary ruler in the city's history. The Republic buried, and with it, centuries of civic tradition. You might think the Florentines would riot again, but they're exhausted. Too many wars, too many losses. They bow their heads, even if their hearts burn. And Alessandro, he rules like a man who knows he's watched. Part African, part Medici, part enigma. He dresses in black velvet, surrounds himself with mercenaries, and builds a court heavy with intrigue and fear. Historians still argue whether Alessandro was a tyrant or a survivor. Some say he was ruthless. Others say merely cautious in a city that never really accepted him. Either way, he doesn't last. In 1537, Alessandro is assassinated by his cousin Lorenzino, no less, in a murder cloaked in Machiavellian flair. You can practically hear the conspirators whispering in candlelit rooms, quoting Livy and Tacitus like Shakespearean villains. Once again, Florence stands at a crossroads. Another Medici leader is gone. Another power vacuum threatens chaos. But this time, something different happens. Instead of collapse, the family finds its future in a 17-year-old boy, Cosimo. Not the old one. Not the banker. This is Cosimo, de' Medici. Quiet, serious, underestimated. And in him, the Medici legacy will find its ultimate form. You're standing in the shadow of the Palazzo Vecchio, and all eyes are on a teenager. 17, slim, bookish. Not exactly the warrior prince the Florentines were expecting, but here he is, Cosimo de' Medici, summoned from the relative peace of Mugello to wear the weight of Florence on his shoulders. Most nobles in the piazza think he'll be a puppet, a placeholder, a nice, quiet boy from a noble lineage who'll sign papers, smile politely, and leave the real power to the old guard. But Cosimo, he's already listening, already calculating, and he doesn't stay quiet for long. You walk beside him through the torchlit halls of his new residence, once the heart of the Republican government, now the seat of Medici dukedom. The velvet tapestries haven't changed. The courtiers still gossip. But Cosimo brings something unexpected resolve. One of his first acts, to take control of the army, not symbolically, literally. He commands troops at the Battle of Montemurlo in 1537, crushing a Republican uprising less than a year after taking power. Message sent? This duke isn't ornamental. He's the real deal. And then he gets to work reshaping Florence. First, he consolidates power methodically, surgically. Rivals are exiled, alliances carefully forged, and the city's government is restructured to ensure loyalty. But he doesn't stop there. Cosimo's playing the long game. He knows power in the Renaissance isn't just about swords, it's about symbols. So what does he do? He begins to craft a narrative. The Medici aren't just rulers. They're stewards, patrons, protectors of art and faith and civic order. You hear the sermons in Florence's churches echo the same theme: divine right, stability, Medici virtue. The city's artists are encouraged, sometimes subtly, sometimes not, to depict Cosimo as a Roman emperor, a wise philosopher, a biblical shepherd of his people. Even the architecture joins in. Cosimo commissions Giorgio Vasari. Yes, the same Vasari who'll write Lives of the Artists, to redesign the Palazzo Vecchio's interior and link it via the Vasari corridor to the Palazzo Pitti. The corridor snakes above the streets and bridges, letting the Duke walk from palace to government unseen. Literal power from above. But here's the part most people miss. Cosimo isn't just ruling. He's rebranding. Florence transforms under him, not just politically, but culturally. You walk the streets and see order replacing chaos, civic ceremonies returning, and public works springing up. The city begins to breathe again, not with Republican fire, but with quiet confidence. Still, outside Florence, there are threats. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V watches closely. He may have helped place Cosimo on the throne, but even he didn't expect this level of independence. The Pope, also wary. The other Italian city-states, suspicious, but Cosimo plays it cool. He keeps diplomatic channels open, sends lavish gifts, hosts ambassadors with silk-clad charm, and all the while, he's strengthening the city's finances, reworking tax systems, and bringing the Medici Bank long dormant back into influence through careful investments and state control. Then comes 1555. You stand atop a hill overlooking Siena, watching smoke curl into the sky. After a long and brutal campaign, Cosimo conquers Florence's bitter rival, ending centuries of competition. Siena falls, and with it, Cosimo's vision for a unified Tuscany begins to crystallize. For the first time, you feel it. Florence isn't just a city anymore. Under Cosimo, it's becoming a principality, and the world is noticing. In 1569, the Pope grants Cosimo a new title, Grand Duke of Tuscany. It's a first. No one in Italy has held this title before. It elevates the Medici from city rulers to sovereign monarchs, setting Florence apart as a power unto itself. The boy prince has become a grand duke, and not by accident. But don't let the crown fool you. Cosimo still walks through the bobbly gardens in simple clothes, still reads military treatises, still debates theology and philosophy with scholars. He doesn't forget that power must be seen as earned, not just inherited. And even though he now commands armies and reshapes landscapes, he keeps Florence's soul intact. He builds the Uffizi, not yet the museum we know, but originally the offices of Florence's magistrates, an architectural statement that civic life and grand architecture go hand in hand. You step through its colonnades and feel the blend of function and beauty, order and awe. Cosimo even pushes science. He encourages the study of anatomy, astronomy, botany. He supports thinkers who gently challenge traditional doctrine, paving the way for a new kind of Renaissance mind. So here's the twist. This boy, underestimated and overshadowed, quietly becomes one of the most effective rulers in Renaissance Europe. Not flashy, not ruthless, just steady, patient, visionary. But even Cosimo isn't eternal. Toward the end of his life, illness slows him. Grief. 2. His beloved wife, Eleonora, dies, and he retreats more often into solitude. You find him in a quiet corner of the Pitti Palace, staring out at the hills of Tuscany, his legacy already solidifying in frescoes and marble. He names his son Francesco as successor, and when Cosimo dies in 1574, Florence mourns, but it does not panic, because the Medici dynasty, once a merchant experiment, once exiled and attacked, is now entrenched, monarchical, mighty, and at the helm of a newly shaped Tuscan state. Cosimo didn't just preserve the family legacy, he crowned it. You wake to the scent of roses and damp stone. The Medici gardens stretch before you, sculpted and serene, but behind their elegance lies tension. Francesco de' Medici, Cosimo's heir, now rules, and with him comes a shift in the wind. He's not his father, not entirely. You stroll through the newly adorned Pitti Palace halls, and everything feels more ornate, more decadent. The tapestries are heavier, the perfumes sweeter, the whispers sharper. Francesco is a patron of the arts, certainly, but his tastes lean toward the personal, even the secretive. Alchemy, esoterica, private studies rather than public displays. And then there's Bianca. You glimpse her, a woman of humble origin, graceful and poised, always just outside the circle of official court life. Bianca Capello, Venetian by birth, noble by marriage, scandal by reputation. She's Francesco's great love, though his marriage to Johanna of Austria was arranged for politics, not passion. And if you think that's a problem, oh yes, so does Vienna. You can feel it, the Austrian Habsburgs fume from afar, watching their daughter suffer in the Florentine court, isolated, ill, and ultimately dead under mysterious circumstances. Whispers grow. Was it disease? Poison Francesco never clears the air? He simply grieves. In his way, with Bianca, their relationship becomes legend romantic to some, repugnant to others. Eventually, he marries her. Scandal be damned. You watch the court squirm, priests mutter, and foreign ambassadors report home in anxious tones, a commoner on the ducal throne. To many, it feels like a crack in the Medici marble. Meanwhile, the grandeur builds. Francesco commissions opulent works the studiolo, for instance. You walk inside and it's like stepping into a philosopher's treasure chest. Gilded cabinets, exotic artifacts, obscure symbols, paintings of mythology and metallurgy side by side. It's less gallery, more mind palace. He's turning Florence inward, making it cerebral, secretive. And the science, it doesn't stop with Cosimo. Francesco is fascinated by nature. He funds anatomical dissections, encourages botanical gardens, and conducts his own experiments. He builds laboratories tucked inside Medici properties, fills shelves with jars and minerals, and dives deep into pursuits of transformation and transmutation. There's even a persistent rumor you hear in court Francesco is trying to create gold. Of course, most dismiss it as Renaissance gossip. But in Florence, alchemy still carries just enough weight to make you wonder. Still, while the court dazzles, something darker creeps in. Francesco's reign is marked by paranoia. Spies multiply. Letters are intercepted. Even family members aren't safe from scrutiny. You feel the shift in the architecture, the corridors narrower, the windows smaller, the guards more alert. The openness of Cosimo's court is replaced by careful calculation. And then tragedy strikes. In 1587, both Francesco and Bianca fall violently ill. The symptoms are rapid fever, vomiting, death within days. The official cause, malaria. But the unofficial explanation, whispered behind gloved hands, poison. Historians still argue whether it was a natural illness or the cold hand of assassination. Some say Francesco's brother, Ferdinando, had enough tired of the scandals, the secrecy, the weakening of Medici prestige. Others suggest it was just misfortune, a summer plague, an unlucky bite from a mosquito in a garden designed for beauty. But here's the twist. Whether planned or not, Francesco's death paves the way for one of the most surprising turns in Medici history. Because now, the robe and crown pass not to a son. Francesco and Bianca's children are either dead or disinherited, but to a brother, a cardinal, Ferdinando de' Medici. Yes, a man trained for the church, a man who once wore the red robes of the clergy and was meant to whisper prayers, not commands. But when duty calls and power knocks, Ferdinando doesn't hesitate. He sheds the cassock, dons the sword, and becomes Grand Duke of Tuscany. And just like that, the Medici pivot again. From merchant kings to warrior princes to secretive scholars to something even sharper. Ferdinando doesn't just want to preserve the Medici dynasty. He wants to restore its strength, its authority, and its glittering international image. He's not here to experiment. He's here to conquer the chessboard. And believe me, you'll want to stick around for how he does it. You shift in your seat as the bells of Florence toll low and clear. Ferdinando de' Medici has taken the throne, and the city hums with curiosity. A former cardinal wearing a secular crown. Now that's a twist Florence didn't see coming. But you can feel it in the cobblestones. Ferdinando isn't just here to rule. He's here to rebrand. You walk with him through the vast corridors of the Pitti Palace, newly energized. Gone is the secretive, shadowed air of Francesco's court. In its place, confidence, clarity, maybe even ambition. Ferdinando isn't interested in exotic oddities or whispered scandals. He's a pragmatist with a polished exterior and a spine of iron. One of his first moves, economics. Ferdinando revives the Medici banking legacy, not by reopening the old bank per se, but by restoring trust in Florence's financial acumen. He cuts taxes for farmers, encourages commerce. You hear talk of new infrastructure canals, roads, warehouses. He founds Livorno, a bustling port city designed to rival Pisa and lure international merchants. And it works. Jewish merchants, Greek traders, even English and Dutch ships find their way to Livorno. He grants religious freedoms rarely seen elsewhere, drawing refugees and thinkers alike. The port becomes a symbol of Medici openness, wrapped in mercantile brilliance. You watch crates of silk, spices, and silver spill across the docks, and you feel Florence flexing her muscles again. But commerce is only one half of the game. Ferdinando turns his eyes to politics and Rome. Remember, he was a cardinal. He knows the Vatican inside out. And now that he's out of the cassock, he's a uniquely dangerous player, spiritual enough to speak the church's language, but worldly enough to bend it to his will. One of his greatest chess moves, marriages. Ferdinando arranges dynastic unions with precision. He marries his niece, Marie de Medici, to King Henry IV of France. Yes, France. And not just any king, one fresh from converting to Catholicism, trying to unite a war-weary nation. You see Marie, off in her gilded carriage, veiled in silk and power. The marriage makes her Queen of France, and the Medici, suddenly, are in every European drawing room. With these ties, Ferdinando positions Florence not just as a city-state, but as a diplomatic nexus. And then comes art, because, of course, this is the Medici we're talking about. Ferdinando doesn't just commission for beauty, he commissions for legacy. He invests in the completion of the Uffizi, filling its halls with portraits of Medici ancestors, popes, poets, and painters. It becomes not just a museum, but a family shrine. You walk its halls, lantern in hand, eyes tracing the brown ink signatures beneath each painting. Here's Cosimo. There's Lorenzo. Even the more controversial figures, Bianca, Francesco, are tucked in, immortalized in paint and shell gold. Meanwhile, Ferdinando begins a more subtle project, the gathering of scientific minds. Under his watch, Florence becomes a haven for early astronomers, engineers, and mapmakers. You catch snippets of debate in palace courtyards, questions about the stars, the shape of the earth, the force of water. It's as if the Medici torch of curiosity has been passed yet again, only this time. It's wrapped in geopolitical strategy, and yet, not everything is so smooth. Ferdinando faces challenges from within. Nobles grumble about his increasing control over city governance. His blend of secular and spiritual power makes some uneasy. But he moves swiftly, reorganizing the military, tightening law enforcement, silencing dissent with velvet gloves, and sometimes an iron fist. But he never loses the commoners. Why? Because the streets are cleaner, the markets fuller, the courts more predictable, and, perhaps most cleverly, Ferdinando uses pageantry. You attend a grand procession, trumpets, banners, fountains dyed with wine. It's spectacle with a message. The Medici are order. They are power. And now, once again, they are unstoppable. But in all of this, there's something quieter happening. Ferdinando's rule marks a transition. The Medici are no longer simply the cunning bankers or the patron princes of old. They're becoming a state machine, more institutional, less personal. The Renaissance glow is dimming, replaced by something more calculated, less Florence the city, more Tuscany the duchy. And as you gaze out over the Arno, candlelight, dancing on the water, you wonder, is this the peak, or is it the moment just before the descent? The air in Florence is thick with incense and intrigue. You walk through the candlelit nave of San Lorenzo and glance up at the coffered ceiling, once funded by Cosimo il Vecchio. But tonight, the church holds not just prayers, but politics. Ferdinando de' Medici has died. The throne passes to his son, Cosimo II, a young man with none of his father's experience but all of the Medici burden. Cosimo II is bright, curious, and pious, but physically frail. His health is a constant concern, his rule shaped as much by physicians as by policy. You watch as advisors, regents, and court bureaucrats gradually swell into power behind the scenes. The Medici, once dynamic risk-takers, now seem surrounded by cautious managers. But Cosimo II makes one brilliant move: he supports science. And not just any science, he supports Galileo Galilei. Yes, that Galileo. Cosimo sponsors Galileo as his court philosopher and chief mathematician, an appointment that sends shockwaves across Europe. Galileo, who had tutored the Medici children, names Jupiter's newly discovered moons after them, the Medicean stars. It's PR gold. You smile as Florence basks in the glow of literal celestial fame. Still, not everyone is amused. Galileo's views, especially his heliocentric ones, are, shall we say, controversial. The church grows uneasy. You hear hushed debates in back rooms, whispers about heresy, fear of cosmic realignment. But Cosimo protects Galileo, at least for now, using his Medici name as a shield. Yet outside the palace, trouble brews. Florence is no longer the bustling commercial hub it once was. Trade shifts. Northern European powers like the Dutch and English begin to dominate global commerce. The Medici Bank is long gone. You can almost hear the coin chests in Florentine counting houses echoing with silence. Internally, court intrigue starts to rise again. Cosimo II is devout. He prefers prayers and poetry over politics. So governance falls to others: his wife, Maria Maddalena of Austria, and his mother, Christina of Lorraine. You watch as these two formidable women shape policy from behind tapestries, doling out favors and shaping diplomatic strategies. There's a subtle shift you can feel in your bones. The Medici court is turning inward. Florence is no longer leading the Renaissance charge. The city of Dante and Brunelleschi has become cautious, reflective. Some might say stagnant. But the Medici brand remains powerful enough to draw artists, musicians, and scholars still eager for patronage. You follow Cosimo as he funds the rebuilding of churches, scientific equipment, and ornate astronomical globes. His court becomes a place of learning, but also of watchful restraint. Galileo publishes again The Assayer, sharp and bold, but always under the Medici shadow. For a time, the family holds him safe. For a time, but even the stars can't keep sickness at bay. Cosimo II dies young, just 30 years old. You attend the funeral, where gold embroidery glitters in the candlelight and chants echo against stone. The crowd bows heads, but more than grief, you sense worry. Florence is ruled now by his widow and mother, with his son Ferdinando II a mere child. Power slips again into regency. This is where the story slows, like a river pooling before the next drop. As you walk through the chilly stone corridors of the Palazzo Pitti, You see fewer scholars, fewer philosophers. In their place, bureaucrats, guards, priests. The court becomes more ceremonial. Even the art shifts grander. Yes, but also more rigid. You miss the wild creativity of Michelangelo, the sly innovation of Botticelli. Still, the Medici remain. Their name, like an aging star, still burns less brightly perhaps, but steady. European courts respect them. The Vatican still listens. The alliances forged by Ferdinando still echo in marriages, treaties, and diplomatic banquets. And perhaps that's the most Medici thing of all: survival. They evolve, adapt. Even as Florence changes, they don't vanish. They just calcify a little. From bankers to dukes, from rebels to rulers, from spark to structure. You pass the Uffizi again, now a public gallery. Tourists stroll its halls, whispering in dozens of languages. They pause before portraits of Cosimo, Lorenzo, even Francesco. Some marvel at the detail. Others simply snap photos. But you know the faces. You were there when the brush was still wet, when the ink still smelled of iron and wine. And you know that behind every golden frame is a family that shaped the world. So you wait, because another Medici is growing up. Ferdinando II. And history, it's far from finished with this family. You blink away the candlelight and feel the weight of time shift once again. Now it's Ferdinando II's turn on the stage young. Inquisitive, raised under the eyes of his Habsburg mother and grandmother, and born into a Florence no longer leading the Renaissance, but still clinging to its glories. He's not the visionary Cosimo il Vecchio was, nor is he a warrior like Cosimo I. But Ferdinando II is clever, and he's curious. You trail him as he wanders the palace corridors, poking at scientific instruments, attending lectures, and asking too many questions for a boy his age. It's clear early on this Medici has a mind made for reason. Florence, under Ferdinando's growing influence, becomes something unexpected, a laboratory. Science is no longer a tool of warfare or commerce alone. It's a pursuit of beauty and order. You see the founding of the Accademia del Cimento, one of the earliest scientific societies in Europe, supported directly by the Medici court. Their motto, provando e riprovando, trying and trying again. You smile. That's very Medici. Their experiments are wide-ranging thermometers, air pressure, gravity, the vacuum. Galileo's ghost still lingers in the room, his notes, his instruments, his spirit of rebellion, though now the church's leash is tighter. After Galileo's condemnation in 1633, Florence treads more carefully, but the Medici still push. Outside the laboratory, however, the world is shifting fast. It's the age of gunpowder and absolutism. While France under Louis XIV is flexing its muscles and building Versailles, Tuscany is quieter. The Medici court is cultured but cautious, brilliant but bounded. Trade weakens further. Florence's influence is waning. Venice, Milan, and Genoa pull more weight. Even Rome seems more lively. But you know what's remarkable? Florence endures. Ferdinando II, unlike many princes of his time, doesn't bankrupt the duchy chasing glory. He's frugal, almost to a fault. He renovates buildings, supports education, stabilizes the economy. He's like the responsible middle child of European royalty, rarely flashy, but quietly efficient. You watch him navigate plagues, famines, and wars on the Italian peninsula. His court becomes known not for extravagance, but for discipline. And yet, you can feel it, something slowly fading. The Medici mystique, the spark that once set Florence ablaze with creativity and scandal, now flickers like a dying hearth. The family is respected, but less feared, admired, but no longer envied. The great banking empire is gone. The grand alliances are shadows of their former selves. Even the Medici marriages become more dynastic and less daring. Ferdinando II himself marries Vittoria della Rovere, a pious and dutiful woman from a once powerful family. Their children are raised in relative quiet. You visit the nursery, where tutors teach not just Latin and theology, but astronomy and chemistry. The tradition of learning endures. But here's the thing. Florence is becoming a museum, not metaphorically, literally. Artists still work. Yes, musicians still play. But increasingly, the city turns inward, preserving rather than innovating. The Medici begin to curate their own legacy. You watch as they transform their palaces into archives of family greatness. Portraits are commissioned not to flatter, but to immortalize. Collections grow coins, fossils, books, maps. The Uffizi becomes more than just office space. It becomes the heart of a dynasty telling its own story, on its own terms. You sense the quiet dignity of it all, but also the melancholy. Ferdinando II dies in 1670. You stand beneath the black velvet canopy at his funeral and listen to the organ drone. The room is full of noble faces, many more interested in their inheritance than the man himself. His son, Cosimo III, inherits the throne. You sigh, because if Ferdinando was the calm before the storm, Cosimo will be the long, drawn-out sigh of twilight. But for now, you linger in Ferdinando's Florence, this calm, candlelit chapter. You walk its narrow streets, past shuttered shops and quiet workshops. You hear the clang of metal in a distant forge, the murmur of prayer from a chapel. You see sunlight catch on stained glass windows, bearing the Medici balls still shining, still here. And you realize the Medici genius wasn't just in building power. It was in knowing how to hold it, however gently, for just a little longer. You feel the fabric fray as Cosimo III steps into power. It's 1670, and Florence seems caught between memory and inertia. The name Medici still carries weight, but not the kind that makes empires tremble. It's the kind that feels printed on a museum placard revered, but fixed in time. Cosimo III is devout, intensely so. You walk beside him down a candlelit corridor lined with saints' relics, his lips moving in near constant prayer. He's not unkind, but he's rigid, conservative, haunted by the pressure of legacy and obsessed with preserving moral purity of his soul and of Tuscany's. You sit in his court and watch the transformation unfold. Theater performances are censored, philosophical writings banned, dancing frowned upon. The lively pulse of Renaissance humanism slows to a cautious murmur. Florentine society tightens. The arts don't disappear, but they tread carefully. And yet, Cosimo isn't an idle ruler. He travels more than many expect, visiting Austria, Germany, and even the Netherlands, where he's both impressed and overwhelmed. He returns with more religious relics, not new ideas. You sense he's always trying to bring Florence back to something imagined a holier time, a purer age. But history doesn't work like that. The Medici court under Cosimo grows more insulated. You see the nobility withdrawing into rituals, titles, and long-winded processions. The city's wealth declines, as does its influence. Still, Florence doesn't collapse, it fossilizes. Cosimo's marriage to Marguerite Louise d'Orléans, niece of the French king, is supposed to be a triumph. Instead, it's a slow-burn disaster. You watch the tension crackle between them, like a sword pressed to dry wood. Marguerite is spirited, French, and utterly incompatible with Cosimo's austere religiosity. Their arguments are legendary. Eventually, she leaves Florence entirely, retreating to France and refusing to return. Their separation becomes symbolic, Europe's liberalizing winds pulling against Medici conservatism. Their children, a mixed bag. Ferdinando, the eldest son, is dashing, cultured, and uninterested in ruling or in producing heirs. You stroll through the gardens of Villa di Pradolino, where he hosts elaborate music festivals and intellectual salons. He's charming, cosmopolitan, and painfully aware of the burden that comes with the Medici name. He dies without children. Cosimo's second son, Gian Gastone, is quieter, scholarly, and deeply unhappy. But he's next in line. You file that away. Meanwhile, Cosimo III becomes increasingly reclusive. His later reign is marked by religious edicts, legal purges, and economic stagnation. He cracks down on Judaism, isolates the Tuscan economy, and keeps the court shrouded in piety. You walk the streets of Florence and hear fewer hammers, fewer songs, fewer hopes. Still, even here, you find strange beauty. You pass a scriptorium where monks illuminate miniature saints with shell gold and indigo. You overhear a mathematician quietly teaching ratios to his apprentice in a courtyard. You visit a physician's apothecary, full of dried herbs and bubbling vials. Florence still breathes, but more like a whisper than a roar. And Cosimo, he lasts. He rules for 53 years, the longest reign of any Medici. You stand in the dim light of the chapel as his coffin is carried past rows of tired courtiers. There's reverence, yes, but not grief. More like relief. The Medici line is now paper thin. Only Gian Gastone remains. Heir without hope. A ruler in waiting with no clear future and no heirs of his own. The dynasty that once bankrolled popes and birthed the Renaissance now stands on one leg, wobbling over a century's worth of glorious ruins. And still, the name Medici is spoken in hushed tones. You hear it echoed in the marble halls of Florentine palaces, whispered by servants, inked into documents, carved into facades. It's a name that still demands a certain reverence, but it's a reverence for ghosts. As Cosimo III, third's candle dims, you wonder, can Jean Gaston rekindle the flame, or will he simply watch it burn out? The corridors of the Medici palace feel colder now. The echoes linger longer. The servants speak more softly. You watch Gian Gastone de' Medici, last of his line, ascend the Grand Ducal throne in 1723, and something in the air shifts, subtly but unmistakably. He's unlike his father in almost every way. Where Cosimo III was rigid and devout, Gian Gaston is introspective, melancholic, and allergic to public piety. He's well-read, fluent in multiple languages, and surprisingly witty. But you can see it in his eyes. He carries the exhaustion of generations, not just the burden of the crown. but the weight of expectations that no longer match the world he's inherited. Florence, too, is fading. You wander its streets and see a city clinging to a glorious past. Faded frescoes, shuttered workshops, rusting gates beneath once proud palazzos. The artists, thinkers, and bankers who made this place hum are mostly gone or forgotten. The Medici name still opens doors, but they creak when they do. Gian Gastone retreats from court life almost immediately. You catch glimpses of him in his private apartments, bedridden for days at a time, surrounded by books and odd companions. A far cry from the commanding presence of Cosimo the Elder or the strategic brilliance of Lorenzo il Magnifico. His court becomes known for its eccentricity. One day, you pass a hallway where small, peculiar performances are being rehearsed musicians, jesters, even magicians. There's a melancholy opulence to it all, like watching an empire drift into dream. Yet, paradoxically, in his detachment, Gian Gastone enacts reforms his father never dared. You hear talk of tax reductions, of restrictions lifted from marginalized groups, of economic easing. Florence breathes again, just a little. It's not a revival, but a softening of the rigid shell his father left behind. Even the Jewish community, long oppressed by Cosimo's edicts, finds renewed tolerance under Gian Gastone's reign. But there is no joy in the reforms, only necessity. Gian Gastone has no heirs. His health is poor. And despite the occasional moments of charm, he avoids ceremony, public appearances, and, perhaps most of all, the pressure to restore Medici greatness. You stroll the Bobbly gardens and see statues cracking, fountains silent. The grandeur is still there, but it's tired, quiet. Florence is still beautiful, but no longer bold. Then, one summer evening in 1737, the candle finally goes out. Gian Gastone dies in his bed, the last reigning Medici Grand Duke of Tuscany. No sons, no succession within the family. You stand at the foot of his coffin and feel a strange stillness settle over the city. The Medici line, so entangled with Florence's rise, has ended. What comes next? Power passes to the House of Lorraine, a foreign dynasty with little connection to Florence. You see their agents arrive, crisp uniforms and unfamiliar accents. The city braces itself for something new, but the people still glance back at the shadow of the Medici, as though unsure whether to mourn or breathe freely. The legacy of the Medici doesn't vanish with Gian Gastone. It crystallizes. You visit the Uffizi Gallery and stare at Botticelli's Primavera, a commission from Lorenzo's court. You step into the Medici chapels, where Michelangelo sculpted tombs that seem more alive than the men they commemorate. You walk through the Biblioteca Medicea Laurentiana and touch the spine of a book once handled by Cosimo the Elder. It's all still here: art, architecture, philosophy, history woven into the fabric of Florence. And though the family line has ended, the name lives on as a kind of myth, a myth born not of perfection, but of power, wielded with audacity and vision, of bankers who became kings, of merchants who shaped empires, of flawed people who, for better or worse, changed the course of European history. And you leave Florence with their stories stitched into your mind like gold leaf on vellum. You've wandered through centuries of ambition, betrayal, brilliance, and decay. And now, as the sun sets behind the red-tiled roofs, you finally feel it. The Medici were never meant to last forever, but they were meant to be remembered. So here you are, at the quiet end of a very loud legacy. The Medici family, who once bankrolled the Renaissance and steered the very heart of Florence, have faded into history's long shadow. But the echoes of their power still live in every dome, every fresco, every whisper beneath the marble arches of this ancient city. What started with a banker named Giovanni became a dynasty that influenced popes, funded geniuses, and shaped the modern world. They were flawed. Yes, sometimes ruthless, sometimes vain, but always human, and always unforgettable. Now, take a deep breath. Let the cobbled streets of Florence fade from view. Picture the Arno River glinting in the moonlight. Let the soft hush of parchment and the distant toll of bells slow your thoughts. You've traveled far tonight through palaces and chapels, through secrets and gold, through love, death, and strategy. And now, it's time to rest. What did you think of the Medici rise and fall? Did anything surprise you? And don't forget to tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I'd love to know how far the Medici reached tonight. If you enjoyed this journey, hit like and subscribe to join me for more tales like this, where history speaks softly and stories stretch across centuries. Now close your eyes. Let the Renaissance rest. Let Florence fall still. And let sleep find you, gently, like candlelight on frescoed stone.